Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Alexis Coe. She is one of the nation's foremost presidential historians, a senior fellow at New America, and an award-winning New York Times bestselling author of, most recently, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Her next book, Young Jack, a biography of John F. Kennedy from 1917 to 1957, will be published next year. Her first book, Alice and Frida Forever, A Murder in Memphis, received critical acclaim in 2014. She frequently appears on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, History, PBS, and many others, and has been featured in and published by most major publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Rolling Stone. In anticipation of America's 205th anniversary next year, Coe asked, how should a president be during a year-long 13-stop discussion tour across the country? Oh my gosh, Alexis, I could go on and on just on your bio. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we actually recorded an episode last year that I don't think I ever got to air, so I will figure out where that is in the archives and I will get it posted. But you are a presidential historian, and the reason why I wanted to have you on was because I did read your book about George Washington, which, guys, you should go out and get. It is a brilliant book. So I wanted to get your sense of the idea of presidential power, the idea of executive authority from when George Washington took office to where we are now. Because, and you wrote a recent piece, and I'm going to quote from it here in a second, that what we're seeing from Donald Trump here in this first few months is extraordinary, but not unprecedented. So why don't you give us a sense of what that means?
Well, it's interesting because I felt like for the first Trump presidency, I spent a lot of time giving commentary, writing essays. It all started with the same sentence. There's no precedent for this. Mm-hmm. But, over the last 4 years, and as it was clear that Trump was going to re-enter office and then has, I started to think about how that's not totally true. Certainly violating norms like the peaceful transition of power, 100% true. But other things that we see aren't. And a lot of this comes from this, thinking I'm doing at the think tank about America's 250. We really have to be honest about who we are. And there's a precedent for almost everything else. Bigotry has always been in the office. The office has always been transactional with certain benefits going to the president or people related to them. I could go on. And so I think that what we have to do, I always hold three things at once, which is a part of our general mandate at New America with 250, which is pride in the founding, a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short, an aspiration towards a better future. And we can't do that if we're not being honest with ourselves. But you started with executive power, executive privilege, which has been the topic of conversation, right, for a long time, but the Supreme Court ruling certainly with seemingly unlimited powers given to the president. That was not what the founders intended. And we do a lot of like the founders said, the framers said in general in America. And it's funny because I'm always sort of suspect, but we look at this document, this 4,000 page constitution, made of parchment, paper thin, easily shreddable, obviously. And it does not say executive privilege. It doesn't say a whole lot about those powers. Why? Because George Washington, who definitely did not want to return to public life, to public servant at the point at the Constitutional Convention was convening, but really hated the Articles of Confederation like so many founders and thought, okay, well, this might ruin us, right? Because they weren't strong enough to get the North and the South were already fighting. They were already in conflict. We had unpaid debts. All of this was going on. So he goes, and there's so much to figure out, even in this short document. It's a constitution. And they think, okay, well, here's Washington presiding. He's the president of this convention twice. Mm-hmm. So he's definitely going to be president. So we know we can trust him because he did something remarkable. He gave up power.
Right. Right. In the best tradition of Cincinnatus of classical times, right? He had His Excellency, you could be king if you wanted to. This was a country that had just thrown off the shackles of monarchy, but because of Washington's unique standing throughout the history of both the colonial time and the early republic, could have stayed as long as he wanted to. He was always, the attraction back to Mount Vernon was always there. And then, just like in The Godfather 3, every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. But he understood after 2 terms, which became a tradition, not a law, not until the 25th Amendment, I don't think, that he was going to go home. He was old, he was tired, he'd done his part, and he was going to go home. And this was incredible. But sometimes, Alexis, I think maybe as much approbation as his history has heaped upon him, we should maybe thank John Adams even more. Because Adams, as our second president, lost and left. Mm-hmm. although he had passed certain, Alien Sedition Act, things that were certainly anti-liberty, as we would see them even then and now. When he did lose, he said, okay, I'm going to go home, which was, I think, also unprecedented in its own way.
Absolutely. This is a team effort. Washington never wanted to be king. That is something. And I think an underrated, I am all for looking at his complexity closely and not as a liability and not as something that we should celebrate in an unquestioning manner. But I do think that precedents, you can set them, but if nobody follows them, then they're sort of worthless. And what we see is most people have followed most precedents for most of our 250 years, which is coming up. This is the irony and the significance of this. All of this could not be more clear. And so absolutely, I think that Washington, you can say that he was overrated. And I don't think that he would disagree. I think he feels like it's too much focus on him. And even the Washington, we were aware of this at some point, even the Washington Monument. It's not my favorite because Lincoln, he gets so big and he has hands and he has, a nose and features and beautiful words. Same with Jefferson. And Washington is just like an extremely phallic obelisk.
Just an obelisk, right? Yeah.
Nothing. Yeah.
A big number one.
Yes. But that's the whole point. He's too marble to be real, but that also allows him to be sort of a unifying figure. Except if we don't follow his precedents, then he's not a unifying figure anymore. Then we don't stand for the same things anymore.
Sorry, you broke up on me a little bit, but I'll edit that out. So let's talk about this idea of executive authority. In your piece, you mentioned, obviously, there's Washington who gives it up. There is Andrew Jackson, right, who famously decided he wasn't going to listen to some things. You talk about, most people don't remember this, but 100 some years ago now, Woodrow Wilson in his time during the presidency and in the lead up to World War I, right, exercised incredibly, I think, harmful executive authority, basically deputizing thugs, right, to go out and go after people who were not necessarily anti-war, but just not pro-war. And then you talk about, obviously, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is, again, another one of those, I think, paragons of the American presidency, but put 110,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. So, and we've, to your point, like wherever there is a concentrated amount of power, there will always be the attendant corruption, abuses, et cetera, et cetera. Nixon, right, was in his own way, he was completely convinced the world was out to get him, but he was not a stupid man, right? Like this was a guy who very well, just as an aside, Alexis, we think back to Nixon, right? Like, okay, Watergate, like he opened China, okay, for better or worse, but he also created the EPA. Like these are things that you could never have imagined that a Republican president post really 1980, right, would ever do.
Well, Reagan and guns, but he had to be shot at in order to
right.
To
yeah,
have
right. It had to be
It
had to be a personal experience.
Yeah.
So give us a sense of why there's the presidential authority, the executive authority. Mm-hmm. And why, though, is the Article 1 branch, the Congress, why have they ebbed and flowed? I know that's not necessarily your level of expertise, but I feel like it's a yin and yang, and then we can discuss the judiciary too.
But as a presidential historian, much like presidents, I'm always coming up against Congress. I wrote an op-ed years ago for the Times in which I said that it's ironic that there is this effort to see all the presidential papers, that this was an act that was passed. And yet, if Congress declares papers to be private, their own papers, we don't have any access to them. And they did that at the same time that they demanded greater access. And as a result, I was denied the personal chance to write about a book on McCarthy that I wanted to at the time, because he had deemed it, off limits. And these have greater effects, though, because what they tend to do is they regulate the president, but not themselves. And what we see here, many of the situations that we keep seeing with Trump, is a result of ineptitude and the failure, sort of the malfeasance of Congress to react in real time to what was happening. We have term limits codified because everyone after Washington up to FDR had followed that precedent. And when he didn't, what happened? Congress reacted. That's why we have the 22nd Amendment. They haven't regulated in the way that they should. So I think that they are very much part of this conversation. And obviously they can continue to allow a lot and not if they simply put country before party.
Right. But let me ask this, because if you go back to any of the foreign adventures of the post-World War II era, that the United States has become embroiled in. Obviously, Vietnam first comes to mind, but Iraq and Afghanistan are close on their heels. And while they have all in their own ways received sort of the congressional imprimatur, they were not declared wars. And once the Congress gave its most basic authority and approval, right, then the White House just runs off and does what it's ever going to do. And across, and let me say this too, it's across multiple Congresses and multiple White Houses, right? I mean, Vietnam was 2 presidents. You could make an argument that Iraq and Afghanistan were 4 presidents, that it took, the presidencies of 4 different men to ultimately extricate us from Iraq, maybe 3 and 4 out of Afghanistan. And, that's where, we should think about the executive authority, not just in the presidency, but all of the things that come along with this. I think in David Halberstam's The Best and Brightest, he talks about, I think he wrote that, the military bureaucracy would decide when it was ready for a war to start or end. Right. Mm-hmm. And is that certainly, we think about the founders again, who had, spent 8 years at war, and had to figure out how to pick up the pieces after the Articles of Confederation. They were very suspect of this sort of stuff, as was Washington in his departure address. So how do you constrain the biggest military the world could ever have imagined in the context of the embodiment of one human being?
Interesting. Well, I think it's a larger question, right? It's about checks and balances ultimately. And that is essential to the functioning of our democracy. Because we can take credit for this too, but we don't want to be blamed for anything bad in the past, just take credit. But we inspired this age of revolutions, right? In which throughout the world, colonial powers, these superpowers were fighting, and revolutions ensued, and they were not at all like ours. And a part of it was the way that Washington set up the war. He insisted on following the rules of war versus the British and the Hessians, who they, outsourced a lot of the fighting to, refused to call it a revolution. They said it was a rebellion, so they didn't have to. They were just, handling their own people. And because of that, what Washington did, which was really smart, is he sort of projected to the world, we are stable, we can be trusted, you can trade with us. Mm-hmm. Now, what happens to the rest of the world is kind of the opposite. Of course, we think, when you think about the French Revolution, what comes to mind?
Guillotines, right?
And that doesn't.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Yes. I mean, James Monroe's diaries from that time and his letters certainly express it as a stressful situation. You have the Haitian Revolution, which is significant because it was happening. You have 2 revolutions in the same relative area with very different results from a colonial power. And so I think that the military in America has always been a part of this tension, and the tension is good. The tension between the branches is good. And what we're seeing here is there is increasingly little tension between the branches. And this has been, in Project 2025, which is much longer than the Constitution, it is a complicated document that I revisit, and it's vague and it's not, but it does say that it's all about the expanse of executive privilege and executive power in order to basically reform the government so that it isn't a checks and balances. So there isn't this equal power among the branches, and they can't constantly sort of outmaneuver each other. That's okay. That's FDR trying to get us into the war and fight Hitler. It didn't happen until Pearl Harbor was bombed. Sometimes these things exist, and that's the way it needs to be. The tension, it needs to be there. So I'm less actually, so this is a time where I am less worried about the military than I am the executive. I'm reliant almost on the military.
Well, let me ask just about FDR in World War II, because you could make an argument that the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, or even really most of the country at that time, Alexis, was actually, in retrospect, gave FDR and George Marshall and those types the time they needed to actually sort of start the process of getting America's act together to actually go to war. If they had not done anything in that regard until December 7th, 1941, the war might not end until 1948. I mean, maybe Russia falls, right? So I think there's that piece. Then the other part is, and I think about FDR a lot, is that he did the things he thought he needed to do in the best interests of the country. Now, he too often had Democrats at his side in Congress. Of course, they stopped his court packing plan, so even they had moments. But I think now, to what you're talking about is, there's you talk about Project 2025, and this is my explanation of it, just to sum it up, and I'd love to get your sense, is Project 2025 is at its core something that takes away the ability of the government to help people at the expense of having a government that can control people. That's my sense as I've read it.
Yes, I think that is a primary goal. I think it's a primary goal for sure. I live near Hyde Park, and so I go there quite often. It has great trails. And also, when you're writing, say, a book on young Kennedy, it's helpful to just interact and remember, hey, when he ran for a third term and a fourth term, it wasn't smooth sailing. A lot of people rose up and were concerned, and court packing and disappointments. We think of him as this incredibly, Biden rivals him now, but certainly this incredibly progressive president who then took people out of their homes, effectively ended their businesses. Everything was taken. Not only were their bodies taken by the government, but then most of their homes and their businesses were usurped by neighbors and other people. Some were protected, but very few. So I think that all those things are true. Isolationist, that's like such an interesting time, because usually we say as historians, the students tend to be right? They tend to know what's going on and see the big picture and just not be constrained by the same things that we think about that stops us from keeping things black and white. Right. But if you look at any of the institutions that are now being called out by the administration for being radical, they are saying that we shouldn't get involved in the war. You have the Harvard Crimson. That's the regular, all the time. And then you also have the Kennedys involved in that. If we want to go for someone we know here, we have Joe Sr. is the ambassador to the Court of St. James. And he's a Democrat, but he's also kind of a Musk figure in that he is one of the wealthiest men in America. He's had some, because we're coming out of, these are people who've lived through World War I and World War II. Kennedy was born just a month after Wilson said that we were entering World War I. So this is all very much, they're growing up in the long shadow of this, and they're living in the long shadow of this. So they have some experience that we certainly don't have with wars. And to them, this is a war that's being fought abroad. And sure, he's invading this country and that country, and they're resisting. But then you have Joe Jr., so Kennedy's elder brother, who would die in the war.
Right.
And he is
in a weird B-17 loaded with explosives that he was supposed to parachute out of, and then it blew up before he had the chance. Right.
That he never should have been on. When people talk about the Kennedy curse, it's not really so much a curse as much as just a series of bad decisions that were made in extreme situations.
Right.
That didn't need to happen. And we all make bad decisions and sort of have to accept the consequences. And he made that decision, Joe, just as an aside, Joe Jr. made that decision because he felt he had been the star. But I argue against this in my book, that concept had been enervated within the family and within their greater world for years at that point. And then both he and Jack are at war. Jack is in the Navy, and then Jack has to go and be a hero, and he gets a Purple Heart and is, the hero of the Navy. So actually Joe Jr. was done, and he was supposed to go home, and he did not have to go on that. He didn't have to fly that plane. He made the choice. He volunteered, and then he died. And there are just every I could argue this for every single Kennedy curse that you want to come at me with. We should do it another time.
Sure.
Because I've thought about this a little bit. So I think that, and then you have this tension, but it is a slow progression. And during this time, you have FDR, as you said, he needed the time. He needed the time not only for America to see what was going on. And of course, I don't think he wanted Pearl Harbor to happen, but it needed to happen for America to enter the war. But he also had to actually circumvent some there were rules and laws against this because of World War I. And he had to figure out the Lend-Lease program and different ways to approach the war. But it took a lot more time. We move at a much faster rate now because of the speed of technology, the way that we communicate, and the way that we fight wars. We're fighting wars all the time. We're just not doing it in the same way.
Right. I hate to keep bringing it back to the military, but, again, there's no greater expression, I guess, of presidential power than the ability to unleash, again, the most powerful military humanity's ever seen. And it doesn't matter if it was 10 years ago or 10 years from now, that's probably going to be the case. But, on isolation, it's interesting because, World War II, World War I, right? Millions of men are drafted into the service. World War II, millions of men volunteer and are drafted. Vietnam, right? The vast majority of them are drafted and they start to come from not every walk of life, but, more and more, lower income, urban, rural, right? Because now you could get deferments. And then, we go to an all volunteer army, but even in the all volunteer army, right, the military still disproportionately takes members of, lower socioeconomic areas because maybe there's not as many options, whatever. And now 1% of the population does all of our fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, thank you for your service and all that. But the truth is that given the fact that we're the hegemon, right, that we do basically print the world's money, most of the country did not have to suffer, right, the fact that we were in two major conflicts, two land wars in Asia for 20 years. And you could go back to Vietnam, where there were so many more people who were involved, right, that, 58,000 young men and I think probably some women, although I don't know the exact number, are killed in combat, not to mention the, and that's the other part too, which is the other side of that prism that we never want to look at, which is if we lost 58,000 men in Vietnam, the Vietnamese lost millions.
That's
right?
what
If
I was thinking when you were talking about all the wars. In my mind, I'm like, well, Europe lost 10 million, we lost it. Yes.
Right. And then in Iraq and Afghanistan, if we lost 7,500, I'm not entirely sure right, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans have died. Right. And so that's the other part too about how we fight war, which is we're very, very efficient at killing. Right. Like we are incredibly efficient at killing people. And there's a big swath, I think, of the American people now, Alexis, not unreasonably, who say maybe we should not do this stuff. But of course, then there's the line of, okay, maybe we should not go on these foreign wars, in these foreign adventures. But then where do you draw the line with something like NATO? But before I let you answer, but also I feel like for a lot of Americans in this moment, right, where we've had this sort of yawning wealth disparity, that NATO is a vanity concern, right? Like if you have time to worry about whether or not the United States is going to fully own up to its NATO responsibilities, that's because you don't have to worry about a second job. You don't have to worry about taking care of your mom. You don't have to worry about making the rent. There's a lot of stuff in there I'm asking you to unpack. So please start where you will.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot going on there. I think one, I have to bring this back to who we are as a country, which is an evolving situation. And what we've seen from the administration is that they are the anti-Kennedy administration. There has been this sort of weird fixation, I feel like, from Trump on Kennedy and dismantling a lot of the optimism that he brought into the world, right? Mm-hmm. U.S. aid was really small compared to many other things. And it projected and did some work of diplomacy and work of, soft power and State Department bidding, but was significant. And it was significant in the way that we projected ourselves in the world. And you also have the Kennedy era. He introduced the Peace Corps and other really important things, right? So you have that, like, who are we in the world? And then you have something like NATO and these other concerns. And you're saying, well, that's not really relevant to everyday life. And I completely agree. And I think that one of the big problems is neither party is in touch with the challenges that real Americans face, as they love to say. But only one is talking about it, and that they're at least saying it. And that's important, right? You have to say the words. But I think that what we have also understood is that, security in the world means security at home. Mm-hmm. And certainly when we have such a destabilizing force at the helm, that is really important. But what I think in general we need to look at is what % of our efforts, our money, our time goes to something like NATO versus goes to anything that would help these real Americans, right? I love to read newspapers that are not the New York Times and not the Washington Post.
For me, it's the Kansas City Star. Yeah.
Nice. I read that too. I recently went to Iowa and loved it. And so I've been reading a lot of Iowa papers, but I tend to go with Ohio and of course, Florida. I like to poke around there. In which, if you're on the ground, there's of course what you read in the national news, but there's also, nuanced and thoughtful takes and that really help me understand. Right.
I've been there twice recently. So for sure.
So these are all really relevant. And what I am seeing is panic in the ways that really affect Americans that are unforeseen because people are moving they're treating the government like it's Silicon Valley, and they're moving so fast and they're breaking things. And so people who have farm loans, for example, and they had the loans, and now the loans have been canceled. Well, they've already paid for those supplies. They're still being charged for it. So they're ruined. Like, these farmers are ruined. And so I do think that we'll hear more about that. But I think that what in general, in egg prices, egg scarcity, we can go on and on of these headlines that we all see and we're all experiencing. And life is going to get, based on the cuts that have been made, so much worse on a micro level in ways that we haven't experienced. And so, yes, then something like NATO will become even more significant. But I think, again, this complexity, we can handle it and Americans can handle it. But we're not, everything is politics, right? Everything is message and power. And that is why I think it's not a real concern. But I also think, and we have talked about this off camera, not in interviews, where I think the problem is just, it's not even the message, it's getting the message to the people and communicating. And I think that can happen through different mediums, but there's just no attempt to do it. And that I do believe also that was the sort of biggest takeaway from my tour for New America, this 13-stop tour, which is that the most important thing, empathy, all these things that we all talk about all the time in a president, sure, but there's this disconnect between who we have in office. And I think the most important thing actually is authenticity. And so even though it seems counterintuitive to what we are talking about in this entire time and in every day in our lives and what we see the conversation in the media, we do have to recognize that it's something to just say what it is that you are doing. And it doesn't even need to speak to the people themselves. It doesn't, but they're like, yeah, that's, as long as there's something coming through, that's what people are going. They're desperate for a message. It's like my favorite movie, The American President. I think I saw it when I was...
With Michael Douglas and Annette Bening, I believe.
Yes. Though recently when I rewatched it, I was really fixated on Michael J. Fox because now he's like our dream. He's like a little, he stands for the people, and he insists on following democratic norms and principles, maintaining them and upholding them.
I know.
But I think that is, I always think about that. And as far as what the concerns and the cares are of the electorate, that there is they can be easily distracted, like we all can, with and anger is the easiest way to get people to listen to your message. But ultimately optimism and truth is what will serve them in the long run. And unfortunately, another president, a real one, George W. Bush, he said, fool us once, and then he sort of, that worked one time.
Fool me once, shame on you.
Yes.
Fool me twice, won't get fooled again. And this is a man I worked for many years.
Yes, but America was fooled once by Trump. Thought that was over. Well, here we are.
We're talking about, the president in the Constitution is the chief executive, the chief magistrate maybe. Has the American presidency become too monarchical? Is it too tied in to our national and individual identity that we worry too much about this person, as opposed to saying, this is the person we've hired to right the ship, keep us on the right track. But other than that, I don't want to have to worry about what they're doing every day. Or is it just back in the 2016 campaign, I wrote a weekly column I called The American Singularity, right? Because the presidency and a presidential race just sucks everything over the event horizon. Is that just the natural, is that the natural progression of things? Is there a way to break that?
Everything can clearly be broken. That's what
fair enough. Yeah.
Trump has taught us. Yes. So, unless it's so broken, you can't repair it. That is certainly true. I think that there's this push and pull and evolution of presidential powers over time. That's true. The country, though, however, one of the big problems is, the founders, again, they were, I always say this, they were not these superhumans who could see into the future, had no crystal ball, but they did leave it up to us to make the country grow to fit the needs of the people. They never predicted we would be this big. They never predicted this population, this lifespan would boggle their mind. Right. Stoplights would, so there's a lot going on that they thought that they didn't predict and couldn't conceive of, but we haven't adapted to that. And I think that is, Jefferson in a letter said he wished that we would rewrite the Constitution every 20 years. We certainly haven't done that. We've had very few amendments. Right. And so I think that there's, as I was walking through the Atlanta airport recently, someone passed me with a sweatshirt that said, "The arc of justice, the arc of history bends towards justice." And we were near Martin Luther King's birthplace and
Right.
significant site of so many civil rights challenges and wins and, incredibly heartbreaking moments. And though it's not my dream, wish I had used a different phrase, to see that phrase on a sweatshirt, I do think it's important to remember that the arc of history, we all depend on this as if it's like a set it and forget it situation, that it will just bend. But we have the Congress, the people, we all have to sit on it to really put some force into it so that it bends towards justice. And that means curtailing executive privilege. That means railing in Congress. It means pointing out the hypocrisies. It's not that difficult, but everyone has, some stake in the game, and that's really important to them. The arc of history, the country, is not a cosmic slinky, right? We
Right.
really need to exert some force for these things to work. That's how I'm not that kind of doctor, but that is how science works, I'm told.
Right. Yeah. Equal and opposite reactions and all that.
Yes.
No, I think that's, I actually said that to a group I was speaking to in Sarasota, Florida recently, which is why are we in some cases, why do I think we're here? Because there hasn't been a countervailing force. There hasn't been a countervailing message. I think back just to go back to both the politics, the geopolitics and the economics of the Great Depression and Roosevelt, Alexis, which is, why I read this somewhere, so it's not mine, but why could you make an argument that, say, American capital was willing to get in line with American labor and Roosevelt? Because they were scared shitless of becoming communists, right? Like communism was lurking out there. Actually, not even lurking, it was roaring out there, right? Stalin was out there. Mao would take a little longer. But the point is that the USSR presented a completely different version, not saying a good version, but a completely different version of how something could be organized. And again, we don't have any, to your point about both parties have failed, the Democratic Party says a lot, but it doesn't do that much. And my guess is that amongst the establishment, and I have said this to many people who are of that establishment, your economic concerns are probably not more than like 10 or 12 degrees away from what Republican economic concerns are at that upper income level. Right? Your concerns, your desires, your wants, your needs, like they all exist on a different plane from the other 89% of the country. And unless you're going to have something markedly different, and I think that's what we saw, which was in 2024, you had Trump out there rampaging around, but telling you what he was going to do. And now Trump is authentic in his own insane way, right? Which is like he says whatever's going to come to his mind. But for, Joe Biden, right, for all of that thing, we don't have to litigate that. And then for Kamala Harris saying everything's okay, we should keep doing what we're doing, right, didn't necessarily seem inauthentic, but certainly seemed completely out of touch. And I think, I'm saying that because I want to get back to something you said about traveling the country, which is, how do you see that? I mean, the Democratic Party, as of last month was at 27% approval. Okay, that's bad. But the Republican Party's at 36. They're not popular either. Right. So what did you see on the ground that you think the folks that listen to this show, they listen to this because they care, because they are involved in their communities, because they want to do stuff? What is it that you saw out on the road? What did you hear that you think needs to be communicated more broadly?
I think that I think in general, Trump, and this has to do with his personality, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's underappreciated about Washington is that he could be satisfied. And that,
Right.
I guess, in today's language, as far as, our knowledge of how one perceives themselves and interacts in relationships and how it forms their attachment, he loved himself first. And he was okay. Whereas Trump is very different, right? He needs the attention. He very clearly is struggling with a lot of things. And the problem is that there is this, you can't just show up. You either campaign or you don't. And for a long time, people didn't campaign. I don't even know if you can call what Trump does campaigning anymore. It's just the way he is. But they didn't campaign. It was untoward. You had surrogates. So either you have surrogates or you don't. But the problem is, because there is this sort of in between where, they're here all of a sudden, they're showing up to our county fairs, they want to talk, and then they disappear. And we don't hear anything from them. That is a problem. It seems like an absentee. It's a bit like being a colony, and then your king and your parliament is an ocean away, and it takes a really long time and they don't seem to care. You need some sort of accountability on the ground. And so it's interesting when you consider states' rights and such. I'm not I consider myself bipartisan. New America is bipartisan, and I think that's important. But I will say that one of the consequences of this, if I may invoke Grover Cleveland,
Sure.
the other, non-consecutive.
Taken too soon.
Yes.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That was he
No,
was
that's
he the one
Garfield.
assassinated? Garfield, sorry.
Yeah, Garfield was. However, Chester A. Arthur, I feel like he's going to get his due. There's a new series coming, and he reformed civil service after being like a Conklin acolyte. He was
Right.
known for corruption, and then he decided that he was going to be worthy of the office because of a really weird exchange with a young woman. That's a different day. But I think what's really interesting about, we hear, this dismissive, like, it's Grover Cleveland again sort of thing, and it's a fun story, and people love if they love presidential history at all.
Right.
You read the big books, or it's reserved for trivia, and otherwise they're sort of like few and far between
Right.
as far as their affinity for it. It's obligatory. But I think that what's interesting to me, it's less this connection that happened to them both, but what happened after. They got there the same way, right? They had this chokehold on their party, and they just railroaded through. However, Grover Cleveland went to the inauguration and such. He held an umbrella and all these things. Then he gets back into office, and he is following something a little bit like Project 2025, where he's just following a rule book, and he will not bend based on what's happening. And we saw this with Trump with COVID. Every president has a plan, but they're buffeted by events. That's an extreme one. You have to react in real time. And Grover Cleveland just did not. And it was the panic of, all these things set off throughout the country, and he just didn't react. And what they did was that opened up the next election to several different parties, and a more populist group kind of overtook what was at the time the Democrats. And remember, everything has changed, and
Right.
we don't want to we just take us up at our word that things have changed. So when I say Democrats, it might mean something else. And the populists didn't win, but they greatly transformed the party. Greatly transformed it. And so I do think that what we're going to see is, and there's no sign of it yet. So maybe this is aspirational thinking, because we're still not seeing anything. Cory Booker, he just took to the floor, and he exceeded Strom Thurmond's, 24 hours. And I think that was significant. But what is anyone talking about aside from this really amazing physical feat? Not really talking about what was discussed on the floor, what the letters he read. That is still a big failure. But I do think that both parties should have, that they should have some resistance, and that it has to either come from the other parties, which would be good. We've changed parties over time. This has been a long stretch in which we haven't. We had other ones. We started with Democratic Republicans and Federalists. That doesn't make a lot of sense to people. With the Whigs, we had other significant parties. This is a time for change. And the only way, though, change happens is when it actually happens. So everyone is kind of returning to the same playbook. You see the Kamala people who are now at the DNC. You see the new head of the DNC, who's kind of an establishment person. So neither one is really changing, and that's to our peril. But the people now, unfortunately, have to really come out, and they don't know what to do. Are we marching? Are we wearing pink hats? That didn't do anything. So there has to be this concerted effort. Maybe it's happening at the ground level. Maybe it's through journalism. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time for this. The third term stuff is going to be definitive for a lot of different reasons.
Sure.
And we'll see. George Washington crossed the Delaware, and Trump crosses the Constitution, and both completely transform the landscape. Both happen over 8 years. Everything could change in our country. And once that happens, Trump he's now the oldest president. He's the oldest president inaugurated. He'll be much older than Biden by the end. So if he gets a third term, I don't think it would be a miracle if he stayed the whole time. This was predicted by the founders, by Jefferson, by Washington, that the Republican Party, he could do it so easily, is the thing. Everyone's like, well, we have guardrails, right? No, that's the whole point. There's flexibility that they could toss out that in a weekend. Have all he needs is 2/3 of Congress. He has it. He needs a lot of the states, got it. And it's over. And then you have very quickly, you have him, but then you have Vance with, his version of Musk, which is Peter Thiel.
I just wrote a piece about this that folks are going to hear this, but yes, I actually just wrote a piece about this, Alexis, which I will send you after we're done here, that the 2028 election, whatever the third term thing is really going to be a proxy fight between Elon Musk and Peter Thiel for control of America going forward. That's now I didn't come up with that. A very smart friend of mine who I was having lunch with in New York City a couple of weeks ago, he sort of posited that, but once I got in my head, I couldn't get it right. It was like an earworm, or an earwig. I couldn't get it out.
Yeah.
But let me ask you that, because actually that was one thing, and I've kept you so long, but you actually opened the door for me for my last question, and it's not an easy one, which is I have tried to explain to my friends, to my listeners, to my viewers, to my followers, to people, my readers, to people I work with, that the world we knew is gone. And that we are in a, at best, an interregnum between the past and what comes next. But what comes next, right, could take 10 years to get to, right? You're a historian, right? We think about this like, as we're living through 10 years, it seems like an awfully long time. But as a historian, you can pass over 100 years in a page and a half, right?
Yes.
And so that's one of those where, like, what happens, right? What happens if all of these things unravel, right? Like, even if a Democrat wins in 2028, all of the things that Trump and Vance and everybody with Project 2025 have done you cannot undo those things. And even if you could, would you? Right? Given the fact that we will be, almost 3 decades into the 21st century. But what happens if that revered document, that parchment document, no longer not only means anything literally, but now means nothing spiritually, philosophically, politically, or practically? What happens if we come out the other side and we look around and we go, well, what do we do now?
We will be in a position of other countries that we've seen over time where the people will have to rise up, and it'll be really bloody, like actual blood, not in this other way that I'm talking about, that wars are now fought. And we will have to have our own bloody revolution, or, like the fascist historians and leading thought leaders in America, they've all left. They've left Yale. They've left all these places in the last 3 months, because this is the sad part about this is it's just a boring checklist. It's a lame checklist they've all been through. It's there. He's doing all the things. You have to get rid of education. In the time between now and then, what will happen during these 10 years? Because yes, policies, I love doing the presidential rankings, but I wish we could do them. They're arriving any day now from C-SPAN, but we do them right after. And it's like, oh my goodness, no, we need time. We need so much time to figure out how these things are landing and what's happening here. Not just with, they created this office. Like, how did that affect that policy? Everything else, it takes time, but we're going to feel it immediately, and people already are. So women are dying, not because they are choosing to have abortions, but because it's medically necessary and they're not getting it. We have Medicare is in peril. Why, by the way, in an aside to an earlier callback, Congress has basically concierge healthcare. They have, for $650 a year, they can just call up a doctor, he'll come immediately. McConnell was in a wheelchair like an hour and a half later, because that's fancy healthcare that the rest of us don't have. So you're going to see like real issues. We talk about, no one can buy a house anymore. That is really going to be true. Nothing will be enough. Nothing will suffice. And people like Trump will say, we're like a third world country, and they'll blame other people. Maybe and every president does this, right? Mm-hmm. They blame the past president for the things that aren't going well, and they celebrate and they claim things that they didn't do. Right. They are. But this will be something that Americans just have to choose. People argue, we're living in a post-truth world, so how do you even communicate that? I recently went to a talk of the, I think, 3 decades long head of Human Rights Watch, and he pushed back against that. And this is someone who has only dealt with despots and military dictators and brutal regimes. And so I do understand that there are ways to fight, but they're not going to be where we all wear pink hats and march in the street. Right. It's going to be so much harder. So they are going to feel it. It's going to take a while. And it's, this is a choice. Everything is a choice. What are you prioritizing now? But the downfall of America is like on the table, like the end of the American experiment. It's there. And Washington, and these 6 lines that he cut from his farewell address, which I feel like we've all talked about a lot in these recent years, because usually the focus is on, political parties. If you don't rein in political parties, he warned everyone, they'll put in a despot because they only care about power. But in these cut lines, for brevity, for whatever, I found that there was another group. And that other group, which speaks to your op-ed, which speaks to your friend's point, which speaks to a lot of the sort of, this realization that a lot of people are having, is that you need a different group also to help you. It's not the military and it's not politicians, because they have a sense of governance, right? They have worked with it. They're going to try to get as much as they can, as everyone does, but they understand how things need to work in order to function as a government, and they understand what will happen. But if you have people who are born of influence or they acquired it through wealth, Washington feared that would actually be the greatest threat. So I don't know why he cut it, that would be the greatest threat, because then what you have is these people who have they just want to sit at the table and they want to pillage, and this is their single issue. Cryptocurrency, we didn't really think of as a single issue. So
Right.
this is not only a fight for our country, but it's a fight for what is right in the world. And we are certainly at a disadvantage, but we outnumber them. And that's what we
Right.
all have to remember. But we have to unify around an idea. And if it's not democracy, then we have nothing. That's our greatest disadvantage. We have
Right.
to agree on something. Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, they're all frenemies. He died estranged from most of them, but they agreed on one thing: America.
Well, and let me just close with this. I said this to somebody the other day. Maybe, that like I've been beating the democracy drum since right about when Trump came down the escalator, and I think it didn't work. I mean, we clearly that is a message didn't work, Alexis, last year. And my heartbreaking realization is because it didn't work because democracy hasn't worked.
Yes.
Because of all the things that you were talking about and all of the things that Washington outlined, both in his printed farewell address and the things that he cut, is that there are too many people, right? There are more of us than there are of them. The problem is right now, the them has all the power, all the guns, and all the money, right? Those are pretty important things to have, except, and this is one thing I try and tell my friends in politics is like, the biggest asset in politics is not money, it's people, right? It's actual human beings. And I think that's one thing, and I hope you'll come back and discuss this with us too, is that, I've been out on the road a lot, and ad nauseum, the folks listening have heard this. And every time I go out on the road, I actually feel better, not worse, because if you've shown up to listen to little old me talk, right? 50, 75, 100 people. And these are folks who are, every day, right? They're not people who spend all day, every day thinking about politics, but they are all informed, right? That's the one thing too, is like the people I've met, okay, yeah, some tough neighborhoods, maybe they didn't go to college, but that didn't make them uninformed, Alexa. They knew exactly what their options were, and what their options meant. And they chose option one, they chose option two, or option three, which is like, to hell with all of you. And I think we got to get a lot more people out of the to hell with all of you column. And it won't take that many. That's the other part too. It doesn't take that many. But as you said, the end of America is on the table, and we should not take that lightly. And we should do all we can individually and collectively to make sure that whatever is going to come next is something that's different and frankly better than what we have. Okay, Alexis, before I let you go, first, I hope you will come back because I could talk to you for hours. Second, where can everybody find your work? Where can they find you online if you dare to go there? And where can we find your books?
Sure. Well, my books, thankfully, are almost everywhere. So bookstores, libraries, and alexiscoe.com. I'm obviously I'll still insist on calling it Twitter. Blue Sky is a great place to go if you want to be with friends and not no one disagrees with you. Instagram, I guess, is where I'm at. And then I have a Substack called Study, Marry, Kill, where I tend to put like upcoming events. But really Instagram at this point and the Substack is where I put things. And otherwise, I'm always giving talks throughout the country and making appearances, and I answer emails, and it's really fun to meet those people on the road too, and to get the person you sat next to on the plane to come to your talk because they haven't been to a talk before.
Oh, that's
so
very cool.
I'm around and always eager to engage, because this is, this isn't a 9 to 5. This is this is a job, and it's my expression of patriotism.
So I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, and they're sitting at the diner, which is one of the greatest scenes in all of cinema history. And he goes, I like what I do. I do too. I'm not good at anything else. I'm not either. I don't really want to do anything else. I don't either. Right? Like it's exactly, I was actually just thinking about that last night. I was like, yeah, I don't really want to do anything else. If this is what the Almighty or God or nature or Mother Nature, whoever it is, the universe has given me, like, amen. Let's bring it. All right. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok, Blue Sky, and says.us, SEZ.us. No bots there, at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram, at Reed_Galen USA. And of course, also on Substack, The Homefront. Please subscribe to Alexis's, subscribe to mine. Guys, we need your help. Build this community. Alexis Coe, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.